Hello. Right. So again, first one is similar question. So without telling us what you do you want to describe, Dr. Yekemi?
Oh wow. I'll describe myself as being multi-interested. I'm interested in quite a few different things. The word that most people used to describe me right from when I was in secondary school is bold. I'm probably the person who, with a group of friends, and runs into the ocean ahead of them, puts my leg in and tests how deep it is and whether it's cold, and then shouts back to everyone and says,
Good to go.
let's go, let's go, let's go. So I think that's how I would describe myself.
Fantastic. And so I've known you for a few years, and I've always wanted the opportunity to ask you this question. So what does Yekemi mean?
Oh, Yekemi. Yekemi means mother's pet.
Yekemi,
And it's from
right?
Kwara State. I guess it's from Kwara State, which is kind of northwest of Nigeria.
Fantastic. So let's dive right into business because
I'm
we're
my mother's pet, by the way. My brother.
that was the hope, but it never panned out. Right. You've got a few businesses. So at a high level, do you want to quickly share with us, some of these businesses, especially Dokaru?
Yeah. So, the Otaru Limited are based in Aberdeenshire, and we've been in business for about 5.5 years. And the car is really about pioneering sales skills in Scotland and internationally. We work with a lot of entrepreneurs and SMEs and large businesses, and we've seen that there's a massive gap when it comes to people's ability to actually sell the things that they develop, whether that's a product or a service. And there seems to be an assumption that if it's a really clever product, that people will magically make a purchase. And so what we do is we've got some technology that we use to identify sales skills gaps in teams and in people. And we've got certain services that we can provide to help close those gaps so that these teams can have more predictable business growth. I've got another business, which I guess is a hobby that kind of went out of hand. It's called Yokritor, and what I do with that is I design clothing using African print fabric. And I mainly purchase this fabric from Ghana, Nigeria, and Malawi. And my close friend and I, we just got this idea, and we made a few different samples. I advertised it on my Instagram, and there was some interest, and we thought, right, let's make more. I have no fashion background, but I was determined to brighten up Aberdeen. Anyone who's been to Aberdeen knows that it needs brightening up. So all the yellow, red, orange fabric, and my goal is that every woman in Aberdeen has something that's colorful because we absolutely need it.
Fantastic. So thank you very much. And I also want to take you back slightly. So again, I've done some digging on you, and you've sort of grown up in different places, right? So do you want to tell us? I'm always interested in what makes people entrepreneurs or what makes them go into starting business, because sometimes when I think about entrepreneurship, I think it's madness. You have to be a bit abnormal to go into entrepreneurship. Yep, because you can easily just have your 9 to 5, get a good pay and go home and not worry. But as an entrepreneur, you're switched on constantly. So did your upbringing make you who you are, or make an entrepreneur out of you, or did you just sort of fall into it, would you say?
Oh gosh, that is such a good question. Up to 2 years ago, I would have said my upbringing had nothing to do with it, because I grew up in a household where my father, he had a job for like 30 years, and also culturally, and you'll understand this because we're from the same country, entrepreneurship appeared to be something people went into when they have failed at something. They were failed out of school, or no one would hire them, or they got a poor grade, and then they'll say, oh, I'm in business. So if I took a boy home to my parents back then, and they say, oh, what does he do? And I say, oh, he runs his own business.
He's not an accountant.
He's not an accountant, he's not a doctor. It's like, oh my gosh, it's probably a scammer, this fraudulent guy. So I think the whole idea of entrepreneurship kind of surprised me. I was surprised when I became an entrepreneur. I was quite reluctant. I felt like I was an old entrepreneur. So giving away my age a little bit, I was already in my mid-30s when I started my business. And it took me 2 years to tell my dad. I waited for my brother to do something worse. and then I shared with him what I was doing. So up to 2 years ago, I would have said it had nothing to do with it. But most recently, I'd realized that I actually come from a line of women entrepreneurs. I hadn't really seen them as entrepreneurs. My mom had her own shop and she had different properties that she was renting out, but I hadn't seen that as entrepreneurship. Her mom, who is still alive, 98, had her little kind of kiosk in the market and she sold food stuff. My daughter, who's 14, has dabbled into like 3 businesses already, and I suddenly started realizing that actually there might be some genetic aspects of it. And certainly my attribute of being bold, I think means that I can skew towards that entrepreneurial side.
Fantastic. And looking at LinkedIn, you seem to have, so you said your business, Otaru, sort of in marketing, training space. But then your background is actually in engineering. So do you want to sort of tell us how you transitioned sort of from as an engineer or from that space into?
Well, it was all by accident, to be honest, because I didn't really know what I was doing, and I'll explain. When I hear people talk about their business journey sometimes, it's very retrospective because you go back and think, oh, how did the journey happen? But the truth is, when you're in it, most of the time you don't really know what you're doing. And for me, the way I describe it is I was finding the light. So I have 2 engineering degrees, and I worked in the oil and gas industry as an engineer. But what I knew deep down inside was that my strongest skills weren't being applied day to day, and that was frustrating for me. I was interested in things that my colleagues were not interested in. I was interested in business. I wanted to sit in on client meetings. I was interested in technology. I was interested in strategy. And the whole building reservoir models and things was quite boring to me. And so I was fortunate to have a manager that started taking me to client meetings, and she saw this thing in me and started exposing me to more commercial sides of business. And then I started an MBA, part-time, working full-time with 2 children under the age of 4. So yeah, I tortured myself. And during that process, it's madness, really. And during that whole process, I realized that the material that we were being asked to read during that MBA were things that I would have picked up in a cafe or an airport and read anyway. Like the articles you would find in The Economist, those are the things that I would normally be interested in. And I just felt really in my element. So at this point, I was senior production engineer. I had a team of 10 engineers reporting to me. And then I went to HR's office, just knocked on the door, I'll never forget her face, and said, I want to move to marketing. She just looked at me like I'd grown another head from the side of my neck. It's like, marketing, why? I said, well, I'm doing my MBA and I've done a couple of courses and I really like the whole marketing strategy thing. She's like, what? She's like, what were you talking about? Fortunately, I was in a company that could do that sort of thing, right? So I worked for an organization that would take an engineer and put them in HR to do a couple of years, and people that come out of that company end up having multiple disciplines. So it's Schlumberger, now called SLB. So it's a sort of company that you could do that. So I was really fortunate to work for a company that ultimately, after a few awkward conversations, let me go to marketing, right? And if they hadn't done that, I don't really know how my career would have gone, because yes, I'd done a couple of marketing courses, but I absolutely did not have marketing experience. So even if I put my CV out looking for a marketing job, I wouldn't have gotten one.
That'd be an interesting CV.
It just didn't make any sense. And so that's how I moved from engineering into marketing. And apart from what I said earlier about my strengths day to day not really being played, I also didn't have role models. Like, I looked around and I couldn't find anybody like me being, chief engineer and running engineering. So there was a double whammy. Limited women in engineering, and then women of color. I mean, there was literally nobody. And so I remember being in my performance appraisals, and you have the HR manager there, operations manager, my line manager, and they'll be like, so what do you want to do? And I'm like, what are the options? They're like, oh, you could be HR manager, you could be operations manager, you could be a line manager. And I'm like, are those the options? Is that it? I was just so bored by the options. And so I was looking for a way to get closer to my passion. I ultimately moved into marketing. And once I moved into marketing, I really started kind of learning. It was a slow learn. And I think marketers found me quite annoying because I was very analytical.
Questioning everything as well.
I was questioning everything like an engineer. And just gradually over time, I found my niche. I found that actually the fact that I'm an engineer gave me this extra superpower that a typical marketer didn't have.
Which is you can sort of break down things.
Yeah, it was a problem-solving kind of muscle that I had that other marketers didn't have.
Okay. So continuing on that journey, and how you then sort of transitioned from that to you started a business, which then eventually became the career. How did that all play out? And lining that up with what Solomon said around don't leave your day job.
Yeah,
Kind of
I love when you said that because
you left your day job.
Because I left my day job. So I continued in the marketing role, and I have to say that there were wobbles. So I remember being on the phone to one of my former managers in Schlumberger, kind of in tears going, I want to come back to engineering. After like 2 years in marketing, and I'm working for another company now, I phoned him and I was like, I want to come back to engineering. Because I started to really freak out. I started to feel like, what have I done? What am I doing here? And it's like, oh, no, you need to commit. You need to commit. And he said, look, if you really want to come back, I have a role for you, but I want you to think about it. Don't make a knee-jerk, decision. Think about it. And it was in that process, probably a process of maybe 3 months, I decided to commit. I decided that's it. I'm not going back to engineering. This is it. So I think it's worth saying that, because when people are making changes, career changes, you have the wobbles and you think it's just you, or maybe you're flaky. I think it's normal. But once I committed, it meant that I was committed to any of the challenges that came. So while I was working as a marketer, I was obviously doing the MBA, and then I finished my MBA and I wrote my thesis, which was around social media employee advocacy. And at that time, social media was really on the rise, and a lot of companies were worried about what their employees were saying online. They couldn't control it as much as they would have liked. So even if they kind of cut off the URLs on the laptops, people had their mobile phones and could be saying anything. And so the company I worked for was freaking out. And they knew that they had to do something with social media, but in a controlled way. And so as part of my thesis, I interviewed companies like Dell, IBM, Nokia, that were doing social media really well. In fact, IBM trained something like 12,000 people to be able to use social media to amplify the brand voice. And so it ended up being an academic thesis, but when I finished, my supervisor said, you really need to turn this into a business book, something that business leaders can pick up and read, because I think there's something going on. There's a wave around the social media, and so it'd be interesting for you to make this more accessible. So in true Yekemi style, I quit my job and spent 4 months writing a book. And those are some of the best 4 months that I can actually remember, because I just focused on writing this book over those 4 months. I got a publisher and I launched the book, and I just launched it because my supervisor told me to. And so I was quite surprised when the book became top 100 in 5 categories on Amazon, because that wasn't the plan. And at that point, when the book did well, I'd gone back to work part-time, and they had made a bunch of people redundant. It was 2016 when there were a lot of redundancies happening. They'd made everyone except myself and one other person redundant in the marketing team. And so you can imagine the annoyance of the manager when I went and resigned and said, off the back of this book, I would like to start my own business and be a consultant and work with companies and help them get social media off the ground. And they're like, we just literally made the whole team redundant and you're leaving. And so that's how I then went off and started Your Marketing Limited in June of 2016, which is my first business.
So just to touch, jump back on those moments where you were quitting your job or jobs. Where were you financially? It's good to touch on that. So did you get support from your plus one, or how were you sort of navigating all that?
Yeah, so there was a lot of naivety, and naivety is not always a bad thing, right? So when I quit my job, I had saved 3 months worth of living expenses, because that's why I talked about a little bit about arrogance, right? Because I thought, I'll get a client within weeks, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. I get a client. So I'd saved 3 months worth of living expenses. And I can imagine that those 3 months now had to extend to like 4 months, 6 months, 9 months. And that really caught me by surprise. I was like, oh my goodness, I hadn't thought of this. I think if I was the breadwinner in my home, this would all be a non-starter. But I'm married, my husband was paying the bills, so even if I wasn't earning money, it's not like I'm out in the streets. I can, I would be fine. So I know that it's different for some other people where you are the breadwinner, so you can't just make a decision like that, which can look really irresponsible. So I had that benefit, and so it was absolutely right. If you've got someone that can support you, it could be a spouse, a partner, or family members, it really, really helps. So that really helped me.
So the point there is marry or choose your partners wisely.
Make sure you have money.
Yep. Okay, so then your marketing stuff kicked off.
Yes.
And then eventually that ended up morphing into the career. How did that all happen?
Yeah. So I think good things always come out of a crisis if if you can keep your head up, if you can weather the storm. And a couple of things that Solomon said that I really resonated with. I think there is benefit in being hugely flexible. Flexibility is the backbone of entrepreneurship. And I think my natural personality, I am actually not that flexible. I'm quite a strict person and I'm very organized and I like things a certain way. Yeah. And so the whole flexibility thing caught me by surprise. So when I started Your Marketing, it was based on this book I had written. I had this idea. I was going to work with companies, train up their staff so that they can use social media really well to elevate, the brand name. I was going to run programs across the northeast of Scotland. That was the plan. But even though I was getting a lot of interest, people wanted to meet me for a coffee and all that, people were not actually spending money on it. And again, there was a crisis. There was an oil and gas downturn, and social media advocacy wasn't the top thing on people's minds. So I was like, what is happening? Yeah, I actually stopped drinking coffee after a while. I don't drink coffee anymore. So I had to be flexible, and I remember having a mentor who said, there's a lot of other things that you can do around marketing. Why are you so focused on this specific social media side? And he encouraged me to look at things like marketing strategy. So one of the things I had become really good at was developing marketing strategies, especially for complex industries. So like manufacturing, IT, engineering. It's like, why don't you offer marketing strategy to companies? And you're a good writer. I mean, you wrote a book. Why don't you write? Why don't you become go into content writing, develop white papers, especially for complex industry? You're an engineer, you understand what they're trying to achieve, and you can write. And so even accepting that I had to kind of bend what Your Marketing was doing felt like failure to me. It felt like this was a plan, and I've now gone off and I'm doing something, So it felt that way. And he said, no, it's actually success when you get feedback from the market and you're applying it. So I learned a lot in that process. And it was during that whole process, as the business grew, I then had to decide, what does this business become when it grows up? Do I need to hire people and become a full-fledged marketing agency? Because my time is finite. I can only have a certain number of hours in the day. I had one staff at this stage, who was, she was basically an admin ninja and did all the things that I didn't want to do. But I had to decide, so what is Your Marketing becoming? Are we becoming a marketing agency where we maybe build websites as well? Are we doing branding? What are we doing? And so my client, who has now become my business partner, she was somebody that I was writing articles for. And so we're having one of our catch-ups, and she's like, oh, so where do you see your business in the next sort of 3 to 4 years? And I just moaned to her. I said, look, I don't know. I've just been thinking about it this past week. I don't know if I'm going to hire and grow this business to be more of a marketing agency. I don't really want to do that because I feel that loses the uniqueness that we have. We now become like other companies, and there's so many marketing agencies. And she said, oh, so what do you think about merging and maybe going, more vertical rather than horizontal? I said, what do you mean? So she was working with people one-to-one as a sales consultant, outsourced business development, nothing to do with marketing, but she had been passing a lot of business to me because when she's helping people develop their sales process and working with them one-on-one, she's finding that they didn't have the marketing. So you like the person you've met, you're having a good discussion, you want to buy from them, you get home, you Google them, as we all do, and their website's rubbish. They don't have a social media presence, you can't actually find any case studies. So she was directing people to me. And so she then broached this idea of, how about we merge and actually provide the full value chain? It's like, oh. So we always joke that she proposed, right? She popped the question.
Was that about coffee as well?
It was over coffee as well. I know, I hadn't quit by this point. So that's how the idea seeded. And it took me about 7 months to be like, okay, yes, I want to do this. In fact, I remember the exact point I decided, yeah, I'm going to go ahead. I was in a boat in the middle of Lake Malawi when I thought, yeah, we're doing it.
Okay. And there's something there for maybe the audience here around, because when you speak to entrepreneurs, they've got this idea of this is what I want to do, this is the idea. And, you know, there's a point where you get to where you realize this is not going to work. And it's hard to accept. And, right. You know, I think you got to that point where you're like, where do we go from here? So, you know, maybe there's a lesson for all of us in that around maybe not accepting failure, but accepting that maybe I need to sort of pivot or end this, you know. And then I guess with Otaru now, it's been a success story, if I could say. You've won multiple awards, and I'm guessing the business has grown since then, since the merger.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the merger was in 20...
So it was in December of 2018.
Okay.
So we're just over 5 years in business. And even with Otaru, we've also had to change, right? So we started out, I'm the marketing person, my business partner Sarah is like the sales BD person. Then as time went on, we realized that it didn't matter how good the marketing was, if the sales wasn't, you know, with the client, if their own sales process and their salespeople were not good enough, it didn't matter how good the marketing is. It's just a bunch of posts with likes and no one's actually doing anything with it. So the conversation now became, we need someone to catch the baby, right? Because marketing is pushing babies out and no one is catching them. So what do we do? And so in 2020, we launched our first sales development conference, which was at P&J Live in Aberdeen, if you know P&J Live. Yeah, and it was ambitious, and people thought we're crazy, and they told us to our face as well that we were crazy to be doing this event. We had 200 people. We did not hire any external events manager. It was us, and there was like 4.5 of us at the time. And we ran this event, and a week after the event, we went into lockdown, so that was interesting. So we're just very timely, but that was you know, a significant point in our history where we said, right, we don't want to be seen as a marketing consultancy. We're good at marketing, but it's almost like what comes after. So we start with that whole sales acumen piece, and then the marketing helps you, right? And the age-old conversation is always, how do sales and marketing teams work well together? Some people think sales and marketing are even the same thing, but they're not the same thing. And people wonder why they're doing a whole bunch of marketing, but sales isn't landing. So 2020 was when we saw that opportunity, and we started kind of pushing that messaging out. And finally, in the start of 2021, we did a repositioning exercise where even our website and our branding kind of changed to align to focus on being a sales enablement consultancy. So we're not doing your sales for you, but we're absolutely teaching you to do it yourself and showing you how to navigate that so that you don't have to guess when you're going to get the next sale.
So something you said and something Solomon has said as well around, you know, Solomon said having a business advisor, someone you sort of seek counsel from, and then you've got a business partner who is almost like an advisor as well, because you can sort of bounce ideas. And maybe that's something for all of us to sort of think about, because sometimes you've got an idea, it's your baby, you've been maybe working on it for a good number of years, and you're at that point of, you know, continue or kill it off. So I think maybe that's where having a partner or business advisor or someone around you comes in to sort of give you that code, that truth around, you know, I've been on this journey with you for a long time, maybe it's time to call it a day, or maybe it's time to go take this idea and go push it somewhere else. So maybe that's something for, I don't know what your thoughts are around that.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much there. I think what I would say first is that one of my biggest learnings over the last 7 years has been character building. Even if you achieve nothing with entrepreneurship, it really teaches you self-awareness and it builds your character massively in a way that I don't think anything else can. So I say that because when I was running my own business, one of the biggest things for me was, it's quite lonely. There's no one to share the burden with. If you want advice, you have to kind of go to a third party. You might even have to pay them for the advice. And then you go into business with somebody else, and It doesn't really matter who the person is. I mean, it could be a family member, it could be a friend, or even a complete stranger. In my case, I mean, she was a client, but in some ways she was a stranger, right? And yes, the burden is shared. We bring complementary skills, but depending on your own personality and your natural disposition, you talk about it in a positive way, that somebody is giving you advice, you're making decisions together. But in some ways, it also means you lose your autonomy, right? So there are pros and cons to being a sole founder versus founding with other people. It's not that it's better to have a co-founder. It's really worth thinking about that, because I don't think a lot of people think about that. So if you don't want anybody's input and you've got a clear idea and you don't want other people to come and put mouth, as we say, where we're from, and they have the right to because they own half or at least a certain percentage, then co-founding might be a bit tricky, right? And so it's that balance between the two. So yes, you have someone to give you advice, but you have to be prepared to take it. It's different from having an external advisor. You can go to the person's office, they give you advice, and you leave, and they might not know whether you took it or not. But with your co-founder, they will absolutely know if you took it or not. And it's this you have to look eyeball to eyeball, right? So I think there are pros and cons, and it's worth considering that before you found with somebody.
Fantastic. So moving on from that, so apart from Otaru, you're involved in a lot of other things as well. You're the Chancellor of University of the West of Scotland, and you're probably involved in other things. And as you said, you're a mother, a wife, and a whole host of other things. How do you find time management? If you can just sort of give us your own personal time management tip in 30 seconds.
Oh, time management tip. So I guess I have a natural disposition to be organized, but my biggest learning recently has been delegation. The more things I've taken on, the more I've realized that I have to delegate, and the more I've realized that I'm not very good at it. Some is just trauma, right? From delegating something to someone and finding out they didn't do it well or they didn't do it at all. And so I'm learning that if you want to take on more, especially as an entrepreneur, you have to have people you trust around you. You have to give them not just the work to do, but the authority to make those decisions. Just because you've delegated doesn't mean you're completely hands off. You have check-in points. So if you say, look, I need this done by Friday, don't wait until Friday to check in. On Tuesday or Wednesday, check on them. How are you getting on with this? Do you need any help? Especially in this remote world, it's not like they're in the office and you can see that they're working on it or not. You don't know. And then, if that deadline passes and they haven't come back, make those checkpoints. It's still your responsibility to check in on those people. So I think as an entrepreneur, time management is key, obviously. But I think the delegation, you kind of get away without delegating for a long time until you start to scale, until you start to grow, until you start to take on more. You realize you only should be doing the things that only you can do. If you don't have to be the one doing it, don't do it. Give it to somebody else who's better at it or that even enjoys it. Like my business manager, absolutely, she loves receipts, she loves spreadsheets, and I absolutely hate them. And just give it, just give it to her.
So if you could give your younger self an advice 5-10 years ago, what would that advice be?
Ooh, I think I had tunnel vision because of my upbringing and what I saw around me. Like I said, I was already probably, 34 when I was like, entrepreneur? What's entrepreneurship? I think there was definitely that tunnel vision. So if I could go back, I would expand. I would have more friends that were different from me. I would have attended more events. I would have really just opened my horizons a little bit to what was possible. Because I think that tunnel vision made it seem like I only had one option. Where we're in Nigeria, it's, whether you're either in oil and gas, in banking, or in politics, basically.
Fantastic. And for our audience here, if you have one final advice, and maybe that's the advice, if you have one final advice, what would you leave them with, especially considering most of them are still in that idea stage?
I think if you've got an idea, go for it. Talk to people, as many people as you can, people that are doing it, people that have done it, whether they were successful or not successful. Don't have a narrow view of what you think something should be. Just speak to people. And I wouldn't labor too much. There's a difference between motion and action. I think a lot of us sometimes we're stuck in motion. You're doing a lot of things. You're researching. You're talking to people. You have notebooks where you've been writing things for years. Like, do something, right? Take action. Just do something.
Yep. Fantastic. A round of applause for Dr. Yekemi.
Thank you.
I know we're running out of time, but we will take just one question if there's any. Okay.
Yeah, what advice for a startup and creating a sales process for a startup that is doing like a product or a service?
Sales process. So I would say a sales process is what's going to keep you sane, right? So the first thing is have some kind of, we call it CRM, customer relationship management system, but you don't need anything complex. As a startup, even it might be a spreadsheet, but just know the people that you're talking to, what their job titles are, how often you're getting in touch with them. Make sure you have a reminder when next you're going to have a conversation. Don't leave it to your memory or to chance. Just make sure you have that. And then when it comes to the actual process, make sure that you have a couple of channels that are using for prospecting. It could be events. So where are you going to meet the people that you can help? Is it events? Is it social media? Is it through partnerships? Is it through word of mouth? Can you use referrals? And then have a clear idea of what you're going to do next. So when someone says, yes, I'm interested, what's the next thing you're going to do? Are you going to ask them to have a meeting? Are you going to invite them for a webinar or a demo? What are you going to do? That's the bare bones of a sales process. But a lot of startups don't think about that. They think things are just going to happen, but you have to drive the process. Never leave a conversation without getting the next steps. So what's the next step? Can we meet next Thursday, 2 p.m.? Does that work? That's the next step. But if you just leave and say, oh, thank you, I appreciate it, and you go off, you've just left it hanging. So that's the bare bones of a sales process.
To get more, you need to pay for consultancy. Right, okay, I've been told we can take one more question, if there's any. And going, none.
Gone.
Okay, another round of applause for Dr. Yekemi.
Thank you.